The wedding cake crashed to the ground in a shower of white frosting and shattered dreams. "Get your hands off my wife." Mayor Jackson Rivers roared, his muscular 6 feet 2 inches frame surging forward as 3 police officers slammed his new bride Michelle against their patrol car, her $3,000 ivory dress tearing against the rough metal. That if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to smash that subscribe button for more. Also, share your thoughts and let me know where you're watching from. Tomorrow's story is going to be just as epic, so don't miss out. Now, let's continue. 3 hours earlier, the morning sun painted Maple Grove Lane in golden hues as Mayor Jackson Rivers adjusted his bow tie one final time. At 42, he stood tall and commanding at 6 feet 2 inches, his dark skin gleaming with a light sheen of nervous perspiration. His broad shoulders filled out the custom-made black tuxedo perfectly, and his kind brown eyes sparkled with the joy of a man about to marry the love of his life. "You ready for this, Mr. Mayor?" His best man Adrian grinned, straightening Jackson's boutonniere. "Been ready since the day I met her," Jackson replied, his deep voice warm with emotion. He gazed out the window of the bridal suite at the Riverside Gardens venue, watching the final preparations. White chairs lined the expansive backyard, elegant floral arrangements adorned every surface, and a string quartet tuned their instruments near the gazebo where he'd soon pledge his forever. Jackson Rivers hadn't always lived in luxury. Growing up in the projects on the south side of town, he'd clawed his way through law school, built a successful practice, and then shocked everyone by running for mayor at just 38. 4 years later, he transformed their small city of Millbrook from a declining industrial town into a thriving community that attracted young families and businesses alike. But today wasn't about politics. Today was about Michelle. Michelle Summers, soon to be Michelle Rivers, was everything he'd never dared to dream of. At 35, she stood 5 feet 6 inches with rich mahogany skin, intelligent hazel eyes, and natural curls that cascaded past her shoulders. As the city's head pediatric nurse, she'd stolen his heart during a hospital visit 2 years ago when he'd watched her comfort a scared child with such gentle grace that he knew he had to know her. "The cars are starting to arrive," Adrian reported, peeking through the curtains. "Looks like half the city's coming to see their mayor get hitched." Jackson smiled. He'd invited everyone, city council members, police officers, teachers, shop owners, the families from the community center where he volunteered. This wasn't just his wedding, it was a celebration for the whole community he served. Meanwhile, across the street, Violet Ashworth's bony fingers traced the edge of her living room curtains as she peered out at the growing commotion. At 67, she was a thin, angular woman with silver hair always pulled back in a severe bun, pale blue eyes that had grown hard over the years, and deep lines etched around her mouth from decades of frowning. Her floral house dress hung loosely on her shrinking frame, and her arthritic hands shook slightly as she gripped her coffee cup. "What in God's name?" she muttered, watching luxury cars pull up to the house directly across from her pristine white Colonial. The Hendersons' place had been empty for months since they'd moved to Florida. She'd specifically hoped a nice, quiet family would move in, preferably elderly, like herself. Instead, someone was throwing some kind of massive party. Violet had lived on Maple Grove Lane for 43 years. She'd raised her 2 children here, buried her husband Harold here, and appointed herself the unofficial guardian of neighborhood standards. In her mind, Maple Grove represented order, respectability, and tradition. "Look at this mess," she whispered, her voice dripping with disdain as she watched people streaming out of cars. Music, shouting, cars parked everywhere. Her pale eyes narrowed as she focused on the guests. Young and old, families with children, well-dressed professionals, but they were all different. Not like the families who used to live here. Violet's chest tightened with a familiar anxiety. Change had been creeping into Millbrook for years, new businesses, new faces, new ways of doing things. She felt like a stranger in her own town, and now this chaos was literally on her doorstep. The music started, jazz and soul that made her windows vibrate slightly. Children's laughter echoed across the street as they ran around in their Sunday best. Someone was testing a microphone, and she caught fragments of conversation about flowers and seating arrangements. A wedding. They were having a wedding in the backyard. "The nerve," she hissed, her thin lips pursing. "Harold and I had a proper church wedding. Quiet, respectful, dignified. But this was turning into a circus. Cars lined both sides of the street, music poured from speakers, and people kept arriving. She watched a group of teenagers helping elderly relatives from a van, their joyful energy making her feel even more isolated and forgotten. Violet's loneliness had hardened into bitterness over the years. Since Harold's death 5 years ago, since her children stopped calling regularly, since the world seemed to pass her by, she'd found comfort in rules, standards, and the illusion of control that came from judging others. She didn't see the love in those families helping each other. She didn't notice the respectful way the young men held doors for their elders, or how the women smoothed children's hair with tender care. All she saw was disruption, noise, and people who didn't belong in her version of how things should be. The final straw came when a catering truck pulled up and uniformed workers began unloading tables and chairs, setting up what looked like a full reception on the back lawn. "This is a residential neighborhood," she said aloud to her empty house, her voice rising with indignation. Her trembling fingers found her cordless phone. She'd tried being patient. She'd waited a whole hour. But this was getting out of hand, and someone needed to restore order. Someone needed to remind these people where they were. Yes, she dialed 911. Violet had no idea that she was about to set in motion events that would shatter not just the celebration across the street, but her own carefully constructed world. She couldn't know that the man in the elegant tuxedo was someone whose very name commanded respect throughout their city. All she knew was that her perfect, quiet street was being invaded, and she was going to do something about it. The phone rang once, twice. The string quartet's melody floated through the afternoon air like silk as Michelle appeared at the garden's entrance, and every breath on Maple Grove Lane seemed to pause in reverence. She was absolutely radiant. Her ivory silk gown flowed around her like liquid moonlight, the intricate beadwork catching the golden sunlight with each graceful step. The cathedral train whispered against the rose petals scattered along the aisle, and her grandmother's pearl necklace, worn by 3 generations of strong women, gleamed at her throat. Her natural curls were swept into an elegant updo adorned with baby's breath, and tears of pure joy sparkled in her hazel eyes as she locked gazes with Jackson. "Oh my!" Jackson's voice cracked, his powerful frame trembling as he watched his bride float toward him. This brilliant, compassionate woman who'd chosen him, who'd stood by him through campaign attacks and long nights at City Hall, who'd loved him not because he was mayor but because of the man he was when no one was watching. The 150 guests rose as one, City Councilwoman Abilene Washington dabbing her eyes with a tissue, Police Chief Martinez's wife clutching his arm, dozens of families Jackson had helped over the years witnessing their leader's moment of pure happiness. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Edwards began, his warm voice carrying across the garden, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of 2 souls who have found in each other not just love, but purpose." Across the street, Violet's call was connecting. 911, what's your emergency? Violet's pale fingers gripped the phone tighter, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper as she peered through her lace curtains. There's a disturbance at 4247 Maple Grove Lane. Loud music, blocked streets, and... She paused, her prejudice coding every word. A large gathering of people who clearly don't belong in this neighborhood. Ma'am, are you reporting a crime in progress? Well, Violet faltered for a moment, watching as the bride, stunning despite Violet's unwillingness to admit it, walked down the aisle. They're disrupting the peace. Playing loud music, have cars everywhere. This is a respectable neighborhood, and we have noise ordinances. The dispatcher's voice remained professional. We'll send a unit to check it out, ma'am. Back at the ceremony, Jackson, Pastor Edwards smiled. Please share your vows. Jackson's hands trembled slightly as he took Michelle's fingers in his own, his voice thick with emotion that surprised even him. This man who commanded boardrooms and led city councils was undone by love. Michelle, my queen, he began, his deep voice carrying across the silent garden. 2 years ago, I was just a man trying to serve his community. But you showed me what it meant to serve with love, not just duty. When that little boy was scared in the hospital, and you sat with him for 3 hours singing lullabies until his mama could get there, I knew I was looking at my future wife. Michelle's tears flowed freely now, her radiant smile lighting up her entire face. You make me a better leader because you make me a better man. You see the heart behind the politics, the person behind the position. Today, in front of everyone we love, I promise to choose you every morning, to fight for our dreams every day, and to love you with everything I have until my last breath. The crowd murmured with appreciation, several women openly weeping at the raw emotion in their mayor's voice. And Michelle, Pastor Edwards turned to the bride. Your vows? Michelle's voice was steady despite her tears, each word ringing with conviction. Jackson Rivers, you beautiful, stubborn, wonderful man. Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. You think you chose me, but the truth is, I chose you the moment I saw you reading stories to children at the community center on your day off. A man who could have been anywhere, doing anything, but chose to be there. Jackson's eyes glistened as she continued. You love this city the way you love me, completely, protectively, with your whole soul. You fight for people who can't fight for themselves. You've shown me that love isn't just what happens between two people, it's what happens when those two people decide to make the world better together. Today, I promise to stand by your side through every campaign, every crisis, every moment when being with me makes your job harder. Never, Jackson whispered, squeezing her hands. I promise to love you not just as Jackson my husband, but as Jackson my partner in making this community a place where love wins. The first police car turned onto Maple Grove Lane. Officer Bradley, a 15-year veteran with a perpetual scowl, pulled up behind the line of parked cars, his partner Officer Martinez beside him. Neither had been briefed on who lived at this address. Look at this mess, Bradley muttered, eyeing the celebration with immediate suspicion. Probably another noise complaint that should have been handled with a simple warning. Officer Martinez, younger and less cynical, observed the scene differently. Looks like a wedding, actually. Pretty nice one, too. But Bradley was already out of the car, his hand resting on his radio. Let's go break this up. At the altar, by the power vested in me by the state and by Almighty God, Pastor Edwards proclaimed, his voice rising with joy, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jackson, you may kiss your bride. The crowd erupted in cheers as Jackson cupped Michelle's face tenderly, their lips meeting in a kiss that spoke of promises kept and dreams beginning. Rice flew through the air, cameras flashed, and music swelled as the newlyweds turned to face their community, their family, with radiant smiles. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pastor Edwards announced with a grin, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Jackson Rivers." The celebration exploded with applause, people rushing forward to congratulate the couple, children running between the chairs with flower petals, and the string quartet launching into a joyful recessional. Jackson swept Michelle into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed with pure delight, her train swirling around them like a fairy tale. This was their moment, their day, their beginning. Neither saw the two police officers pushing through the celebrating crowd. Neither heard Officer Bradley's radio crackling to life. And across the street, Violet Ashworth watched through her curtains with grim satisfaction, completely unaware that she had just set in motion the most humiliating moment of her life. "Freeze! Nobody move!" Officer Bradley's commanding voice shattered the celebration like a gunshot. The music stopped mid-note, laughter died in throats, and children instinctively pressed closer to their parents as two uniformed officers pushed through the crowd of wedding guests. Jackson felt Michelle's body tense against his as the joy drained from her face. He'd seen this look before, the fear that crept into his wife's eyes whenever police appeared unexpectedly. The same fear that lived in every black person's chest, no matter how successful, how respected, how powerful they thought they were. "Officers," Jackson called out, his voice steady but his mayor's instincts already on high alert. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "Is there a problem?" Bradley's hard eyes swept over the crowd dismissively, his hand resting on his radio. At 45, he was built like a linebacker with graying brown hair and a permanent scowl that had deepened over his 15 years on the force. He'd responded to dozens of noise complaints in upscale neighborhoods, and they always followed the same pattern. "We received a complaint about a disturbance," Bradley announced loudly, his tone suggesting he'd already decided everyone here was guilty of something. "Noise violations, illegal parking, public nuisance." "A disturbance?" Michelle's voice rose with incredulous anger, her protective instincts flaring. "This is our wedding." "Ma'am, I need you to calm down," Bradley replied with practiced condescension, already reaching for his handcuffs. He'd made up his mind the moment he saw the crowd. "We're going to need to see some identification and—" "Wait just a minute." Jackson stepped forward, his 6 feet 2 inches frame imposing but his hands clearly visible and non-threatening. Years of navigating police encounters had taught him the dance. "Officer, I'm sure we can resolve this. If there's been a noise complaint, we're happy to turn the music down." But something in Bradley's demeanor had shifted. The way Jackson carried himself, the expensive tuxedo, the confidence in his voice, it all rubbed against Bradley's preconceptions like sandpaper. In his experience, people who looked like this crowd needed to be reminded of their place. "Sir, step back," Bradley's voice hardened. "This is now a police investigation." The wedding guests exchanged worried glances. City Councilwoman Abilene Washington pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the record button. Police Chief Martinez's wife tugged on her husband's sleeve. He was off duty, but his jaw was already clenching as he watched his own officers handle the situation. "Investigation of what exactly?" Jackson's voice remained calm, but Michelle could see the muscle in his jaw ticking. She knew that look. Her husband was furious but fighting to stay controlled. Public disturbance, possible property damage, unlawful assembly. Bradley rattled off charges like he was reading from a script. And now interfering with a police investigation. Interfering? Michelle stepped forward, her nurse's training making her naturally protective. We're standing in our wedding reception asking you what's wrong. That's when Bradley made his fatal mistake. Ma'am, you need to step back and put your hands where I can see them, he barked, his hand moving to his taser. Now! The wedding guests gasped collectively. Someone screamed. Children started crying. And Jackson Rivers, the man who'd spent 4 years building bridges between the police department and the community, felt something snap inside his chest. That's my wife, Jackson roared, his composure finally cracking as he watched Officer Martinez move toward Michelle with handcuffs. Get your hands off her. What happened next would be replayed on every news channel in America within hours. Officer Martinez grabbed Michelle's wrist, spinning her around with unnecessary force. Her $3,000 ivory dress caught on his radio, tearing at the delicate beadwork as he slammed her against the patrol car. You're under arrest for resisting an officer, Martinez shouted, his knee pressing into Michelle's back as she cried out in pain and shock. The wedding cake, 3 tiers of vanilla and raspberry with hand-piped roses, crashed to the ground as guests surged forward in outrage, frosting and flowers scattering across the grass like the shattered dreams of what should have been the happiest day of their lives. Jackson lunged forward, every instinct screaming to protect his wife. But Officer Bradley was ready with his taser. Sir, step back or you'll be arrested too. Jackson, no. Michelle gasped from her position against the car, tears streaming down her face. Don't give them a reason. But Jackson was past reason. This was his wife. His wedding day. His community watching their mayor and his bride being brutalized by the very officers he worked with every day. I demand to know what crime you think we've committed, he shouted, his powerful voice carrying across the chaos. Phones were recording from every angle now. Guests were screaming. Children were sobbing. The beautiful celebration had become a scene from a nightmare, and across the street, Violet Ashworth watched with growing horror as she realized. This wasn't going according to plan. We received a report of suspicious activity, Bradley panted, adrenaline making him double down on his mistake. Public disturbance, possible drugs, gang activity? Michelle's voice cracked with disbelief from her position against the car. At our wedding? That's when Officer Bradley made his final, career-ending error. He keyed his radio to run the groom's identification, confident he'd find outstanding warrants or a criminal record that would justify this humiliating scene. Control, I need you to run a name for me, he said into his radio, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent yard. Jackson Rivers, black male, approximately 40, 6'2". The radio crackled back to life 30 seconds later. Bradley, can you repeat that name? Jackson Rivers. Bradley repeated impatiently, still holding his taser trained on the man who was trying to protect his wife. A longer pause. Then, Bradley, that's Mayor Jackson Rivers. Stand down immediately. I repeat, stand down. The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Bradley's face went white as the words sank in. Officer Martinez's hands went slack on Michelle's arms. And every single wedding guest held their breath as they watched 2 police officers realize they had just committed career suicide on camera. Jackson's eyes blazed with quiet fury as he straightened his torn tuxedo jacket. Now, he said softly, his voice carrying the full weight of his office, are you going to get your hands off my wife? The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Officer Martinez's hands trembled as he slowly released Michelle, his face ashen as the magnitude of his mistake crashed over him. Mayor Jackson Rivers. The man who'd personally recruited him to the force. the man whose recommendation had gotten him promoted to detective track. "Mr. Mayor." "We didn't," Martinez stammered, but Jackson's raised hand cut him off. "Don't." Jackson's voice was deadly quiet as he moved to his wife, his hands gentle as he helped her stand. Michelle's dress was torn, her perfect hair disheveled, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Just don't." But then something unexpected happened. "Wait," Michelle said softly, her nurse's instincts kicking in as she noticed Officer Bradley swaying on his feet. "Are you okay?" Bradley's face had gone from white to gray, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. His radio clattered to the ground as he clutched his chest. "Can't breathe," he gasped. "He's having a panic attack," Michelle announced, her professional training overriding her personal anger. "The worse." "Jackson, call an ambulance." "Are you serious right now?" Adrian, Jackson's best man, stepped forward incredulously. "After what they just did to you?" But Michelle was already moving, her torn wedding dress trailing behind her as she knelt beside the officer who just humiliated her. "Sit down. Put your head between your knees. Breathe slowly." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The black woman these officers had just brutalized was now trying to save one of their lives. "Michelle, you don't have to," Jackson started. "Yes, I do," she said firmly, her hands checking Bradley's pulse. "It's who I am." Jackson felt his heart swell with love and pride even as fury burned in his chest. This was why he'd married her. This was why she made him a better man. "Control, we need paramedics at 4247 Maple Grove Lane," Officer Martinez radioed, his voice shaking. "Officer down, possible cardiac event." As they waited for the ambulance, something even more unexpected happened. A small, frail voice called out from across the street. "Excuse me, is everything all right?" Every head turned to see Violet Ashworth standing at the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn, her pale blue eyes wide with shock. She clutched her floral housecoat around her thin frame, looking suddenly very old and very fragile. "You?" Jackson's voice was ice as he recognized her from city council meetings where she'd complained about those people moving into the neighborhood. "You're the one who called them." Violet's face crumpled. She'd watched the entire scene unfold through her window, and the reality of what she'd set in motion was crushing her. This wasn't some anonymous disturbance. This was her mayor, her community leader, being humiliated because of her prejudice. "But I didn't know," she whispered. "Didn't know what?" Michelle looked up from where she was monitoring Officer Bradley's breathing. "That we were human beings having a wedding?" The ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. "Ma'am," Jackson said, his voice deadly calm as he walked toward Violet, "you called the police on my wedding because you saw black people celebrating in your neighborhood. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." Violet's legs wobbled, and she grabbed her porch railing for support. "The noise. I just wanted—" "You wanted us gone," Jackson finished. "You saw successful, happy black people and couldn't stand it." But then Michelle's voice cut through the tension with an unexpected observation. "Jackson, look at her hands." Everyone turned to see Violet's hands shaking violently, her face pale as chalk. She was having her own medical crisis. "Oh no," Michelle breathed, recognizing the signs immediately. "She's going into shock." Before anyone could stop her, Michelle stood up, leaving Officer Bradley in the care of his partner, and walked across the street to the woman who'd destroyed her wedding day. "Ma'am, I need you to sit down," Michelle said gently, her professional instincts overriding everything else. "Don't touch me," Violet whispered, but there was no venom in it anymore. Just fear and shame. "I'm a nurse," Michelle said softly. "You're having a panic attack. I'm not going to hurt you." The ambulance arrived, paramedics rushing to Officer Bradley first. But Michelle waved one over to Violet. "Check her blood pressure," she instructed. "Possible anxiety-induced hypertension." The irony was staggering. The black bride, still in her torn wedding dress, was now caring for both the officer who'd arrested her and the neighbor who'd set the whole nightmare in motion. Jackson watched his wife with a mixture of awe and frustration. How could she be so compassionate to people who just tried to destroy their happiness? "Why?" Violet whispered to Michelle as the paramedic checked her vitals. "Why are you helping me?" Michelle was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Because that's what love does," she finally said. "It chooses to heal instead of hurt." "But what I did was wrong," Michelle finished. "But you're still a human being having a medical emergency." The crowd of wedding guests watched in stunned silence as their mayor's wife, the woman they'd just seen brutalized and humiliated, knelt beside her tormentor with gentle hands and a kind voice. Officer Martinez approached Jackson cautiously. "Mr. Mayor, I know there's nothing we can say." "You're right," Jackson cut him off. "There isn't. But we'll deal with this later. Right now, my wife is doing what she does best, taking care of people who don't deserve it." The paramedic checking Violet announced she needed to be transported for observation. As they helped her onto a stretcher, she grabbed Michelle's hand with surprising strength. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I'm so sorry." Michelle squeezed the old woman's hand gently. "I know." As both ambulances pulled away, one carrying Officer Bradley, the other carrying Violet, Jackson and Michelle stood in the ruins of their wedding reception, surrounded by scattered cake and shocked guests. Their perfect day was destroyed. But somehow, in the ashes of their celebration, something profound was beginning to grow. Something that would change not just their lives, but their entire community. 3 hours later, Millbrook General Hospital hummed with quiet activity as Michelle sat in the family waiting area, still wearing her torn wedding dress. She'd insisted on coming, despite Jackson's protests, despite her exhaustion, despite everything. "Mrs. Rivers?" Dr. Patel approached with a gentle smile. "Mrs. Ashworth is stable. The panic attack triggered a minor, hypertensive episode, but she's going to be fine. She's been asking for you." Jackson, who'd been pacing the hallway in his wrinkled tuxedo, stopped short. "She asked for Michelle?" "Specifically," Dr. Patel nodded. "She seems quite distressed about something and says she needs to speak with the beautiful nurse who helped her." Michelle exchanged glances with her new husband. They'd spent their wedding night in a hospital because she couldn't shake the image of that frail old woman's terrified eyes. "I'll go," Michelle said softly. "We'll go," Jackson corrected, taking her hand. Room 314 was dimly lit, and Violet looked impossibly small in the hospital bed. Her silver hair hung loose around her shoulders, the first time it hadn't been in that severe bun, and without her harsh expression, she looked like what she truly was, a lonely, scared old woman. "You came," Violet whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. Michelle pulled a chair beside the bed while Jackson stood protectively behind her. "How are you feeling?" "Ashamed," Violet said simply. "Doctor says I had a panic attack brought on by guilt and stress. 43 years I've lived on that street, and today I became someone I don't recognize." She turned to Jackson, her pale blue eyes filled with genuine remorse. "Mr. Mayor, I've watched you transform this city. I've seen the community centers you've built, the programs for seniors like me. And today I repaid your service by calling the police on my wedding because we're black," Jackson said quietly, but not unkindly. Violet flinched as if he'd slapped her. "Yes." The silence stretched uncomfortably until Violet spoke again, her voice barely audible. Can I tell you about my daughter?" Michelle and Jackson exchanged surprised glances. Neither had expected this. "Her name was Crystal," Violet continued, her eyes focusing on something far away. "Beautiful girl. Looked just like me when I was young, but with Harold's kind heart. She was 26 when she died." Michelle's hand instinctively moved toward Violet's, then stopped. "I'm sorry for your loss." "She was a social worker," Violet whispered. "Worked with families in crisis, mostly in the neighborhoods where people like you lived." She looked at Jackson apologetically. "Crystal used to bring her cases home with her, not literally, but emotionally. She'd cry over children who didn't have enough to eat, mothers working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on." Violet's voice grew stronger as the memories flowed. "I used to tell her she was getting too involved, that she needed to maintain professional distance. But she'd look at me with those big blue eyes and say, 'Mama, love doesn't have distance. Love shows up.'" Jackson felt Michelle's hand squeeze his as they realized where this was going. 5 years ago, Crystal was driving home from a late-night emergency call. A family needed help, and she couldn't say no. A drunk driver ran a red light. Violet's voice broke. She died instantly. Michelle couldn't help herself anymore. She reached out and took Violet's weathered hand in both of hers. "After the funeral, I was so angry," Violet continued. "Angry at God, angry at the world, angry at the families who'd needed her help so desperately that she was out there at midnight trying to save them. In my grief, I started blaming the wrong people. I convinced myself that if Crystal hadn't cared so much about those neighborhoods, she'd still be alive." Jackson sat down heavily in the other chair as understanding dawned. "You blamed us," he said softly. "People who looked like Crystal's clients." Violet nodded miserably. "My grief turned into something ugly. I started seeing threats where there weren't any, problems where there was just life. And today, when I saw your beautiful celebration, all I could think was that Crystal should have been there, should have been dancing at her own wedding instead of lying in Millbrook Cemetery." Tears streamed down her face as the truth poured out. "So I called the police on your joy because I couldn't bear to see happiness I'll never have again. And in doing so, I became everything Crystal fought against her entire life." The room fell silent except for the soft beeping of monitors and Violet's quiet sobs. "What was Crystal's favorite thing about her work?" Michelle asked gently. Violet looked up, surprised by the question. She used to say she loved watching families find their strength. She'd come home talking about mothers who'd overcome addiction to get their children back, fathers who'd learned to show love instead of anger, communities that came together to protect their own. "She sounds like she was an amazing woman," Jackson said sincerely. "She was," Violet whispered. "And today I dishonored everything she stood for." Michelle was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something that shocked both Jackson and Violet. She stood up, walked to the small closet, and pulled out her phone. "What's Crystal's last name?" she asked. "Thompson. Crystal Thompson." "Why?" Michelle's fingers flew over her phone screen, then she turned it toward Violet. "It was Crystal's obituary from 5 years ago, but Michelle had scrolled down to the comments section. Look, Michelle said softly, comment after comment from families Crystal had helped, children she'd saved, mothers whose lives she changed. Dozens of people from every background, every neighborhood, every walk of life, all united in their love for a woman who'd seen past color and class to the human heart underneath. She touched more lives than you know, Michelle said gently. And today, when you helped me understand your pain, when you let me see your heart, that was Crystal's love working through you. Violet stared at the screen through her tears, reading testimonial after testimonial about her daughter's incredible impact. I don't deserve forgiveness, she whispered. None of us do, Jackson said quietly. But sometimes we get it anyway. That's called grace. And in that quiet hospital room, surrounded by the beeping of machines and the soft hum of healing, 3 people who should have been enemies began the slow, beautiful work of becoming family. 2 days later, Violet Ashworth's doorbell rang at exactly 7:43 a.m., shattering the silence of her pristine home. She shuffled to the door in her worn slippers and robe, expecting perhaps a package or the mailman. Instead, she found Michelle Rivers standing on her porch, still stunning even in simple jeans and a sweater, holding a large casserole dish and wearing a smile that could melt glaciers. Good morning, Mrs. Ashworth. I brought breakfast. Behind Michelle stood Jackson, looking bemused and slightly concerned, carrying what appeared to be enough groceries to feed a small army. Why? Violet stammered, her hand clutching her robe closed. Because, Michelle said simply, Crystal taught you that love shows up. So here we are, showing up. Before Violet could protest, Michelle had swept past her into the house, Jackson following with an apologetic shrug. Michelle, you can't just, Jackson started. Can't what? Bring breakfast to a neighbor? Michelle was already unpacking containers in Violet's spotless kitchen. Mrs. Ashworth, when did you last eat a real meal? Violet stood frozen in her own doorway, watching this whirlwind of compassion invade her perfectly ordered world. Yesterday? I think. You think. Michelle spun around, hands on her hips, and suddenly she wasn't the gentle nurse or gracious bride. She was a force of nature. Jackson, look at this refrigerator. Jackson opened the fridge and his heart sank. A half-empty carton of milk, some wilted lettuce, and a container of what might have once been soup. The freezer contained only ice and a single frozen dinner. Mrs. Ashworth, Jackson said gently, how long have you been living like this? Since Harold died, Violet whispered, suddenly looking embarrassed. I never learned to cook for one person. Everything Crystal taught me was for feeding her father and her friends when they'd visit. That's when the chaos truly began. Michelle, discovering that Violet hadn't been eating properly for 5 years, went into full nurse mode. She started pulling out her phone, making lists, and issuing instructions to Jackson like a general commanding troops. We need to set up a meal schedule. Jackson, call Dr. Patel and get her nutritional requirements. Mrs. Ashworth, do you have any food allergies? Never mind, we'll figure it out. Where do you keep your pots and pans? Michelle, slow down, Jackson laughed, watching his wife transform the quiet house into mission control. You're overwhelming her. But Violet was staring at Michelle with something approaching wonder. You want to cook for me? Not just cook, Michelle corrected, pulling ingredients from bags with military precision. Teach. Crystal's work was helping families find their strength, right? Well, eating properly is strength. Taking care of yourself is strength. But I ruined your wedding, Violet said weakly. Michelle paused, a bag of flour in her hands, and looked directly at Violet. "Mrs. Ashworth, can I tell you something?" Violet nodded. "That wedding was beautiful, but it was just one day. What's happening right now? This is a lifetime. This is choosing love over hurt, hope over hate. This is Crystal's real legacy." That's when Violet broke down completely, 67 years of loneliness and grief pouring out in gut-wrenching sobs. Michelle immediately wrapped her arms around the older woman, holding her like she was precious china. "I miss her so much," Violet wept into Michelle's shoulder. "I miss having someone to cook for, someone to fuss over, someone who needed me." "Well," Michelle said softly, pulling back to look at Violet's tear-stained face, "now you have us." Jackson watched his wife work her magic and felt that familiar surge of pride and love. This was why he'd fallen for her. This was why she made him a better leader, a better man. "All right," he said, rolling up his sleeves, "what are we cooking?" What followed was the most chaotic, beautiful cooking lesson in the history of Maple Grove Lane. Michelle attempted to teach Violet how to make pancakes from scratch while Jackson tried to keep up with increasingly complicated instructions. Flour ended up everywhere, in Violet's silver hair, on Jackson's shirt, coating the pristine countertops that hadn't seen this much activity in years. "No, no, Mrs. Ashworth," gentle folding motions, Michelle demonstrated. "You don't want to overmix the batter. Like this." Violet attempted the motion and accidentally flung batter across the kitchen, hitting Jackson squarely in the face. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Jackson started laughing deep, genuine belly laughs that shook his whole frame. Michelle joined in, and finally, for the first time in 5 years, Violet Ashworth laughed until tears streamed down her cheeks. "I haven't made this big a mess since Crystal was 5 and insisted on helping me bake Christmas cookies," Violet gasped between giggles. "Well," Michelle grinned, surveying the flour-covered kitchen, "Crystal would be proud of this beautiful disaster." As they cooked together, something magical happened. Violet began sharing stories about Crystal's childhood, her dreams, her boyfriend who'd planned to propose before the accident. Michelle shared stories about her own family, her work at the hospital, her dreams of having children with Jackson. Jackson found himself talking about his own journey, growing up poor, working his way through law school, the loneliness of public service when everyone expected perfection. "You know what Crystal used to say," Violet said as they sat down to eat their somewhat lopsided pancakes. "She said families aren't just born, they're chosen. People who show up for each other, who choose love even when it's hard." Michelle reached across the table and took Violet's flour-dusted hand. "Then I guess we're family now." Jackson raised his coffee mug. "To Crystal Thompson, who taught us all how to show up." "To Crystal," Violet whispered, her voice thick with emotion but her eyes bright with something she hadn't felt in years. Hope that as they sat in that chaotic, flour-covered kitchen, sharing imperfect pancakes and perfect understanding, none of them could have imagined that their happiness was about to be shattered by a knock at the door, a knock that would test every bond they'd just forged and threatened to destroy the fragile healing they'd begun. The aggressive pounding on Violet's front door shattered the peaceful morning like a sledgehammer through glass. "Violet Ashworth, open this door." Michelle's coffee mug froze halfway to her lips as Jackson's entire body went rigid. Through the lace curtains, they could see news vans lined up on the street, cameras rolling, reporters jockeying for position. "Oh no," Violet whispered, her face draining of color. "Oh no, no, no." The pounding intensified. "Ms. Ashworth, this is Channel 7 News." We need to speak with you about the racist attack on Mayor Rivers' wedding. Jackson was already on his feet, his protective instincts flaring. Stay here, he told the women, but Michelle grabbed his arm. Jackson, if they see you here, they'll twist it into something worse. But it was too late. Through the kitchen window, they could see a reporter had spotted Jackson's car in the driveway. Breaking news, came the shout from outside. Mayor Rivers is currently inside the home of the woman who racially profiled his wedding. Violet's hands began shaking so violently she couldn't hold her fork. They're going to destroy me. My reputation, my home, everything Crystal worked for. Violet, breathe, Michelle said, but her own voice was tight with anxiety that Jackson's phone exploded with notifications. Text after text, call after call, his press secretary's voice cutting through the chaos. Mr. Mayor, you need to get out of there now. This looks terrible. The optics. Jackson's voice was deadly quiet as he hung up and turned to Violet, who was now hyperventilating. Is that what you are to them? Optics. More pounding, more shouting. Ms. Ashworth, our sources say you've been secretly meeting with the mayor. Are you being pressured to apologize? Are you being silenced? I can't. Violet gasped, clutching her chest. I can't breathe. They think I'm some kind of monster. Michelle knelt beside Violet's chair, taking her hands. You're not a monster. You made a mistake and you're trying to make it right. But they don't know that. Violet's voice cracked. All they see is the woman who called police on a black wedding. They don't know about Crystal, about what I've lost. Jackson's phone rang again. This time it was Police Chief Martinez, his voice urgent. Mr. Mayor, we have a situation. Someone leaked the 911 call. It's all over social media. #RacistNeighbor is trending nationally. There are people driving to Millbrook right now, planning to protest outside her house. The blood drained from Jackson's face. How many people? Hundreds, sir. Maybe thousands. This is about to become a circus. Through the window, they could already see more cars arriving. Young people with signs, older activists with megaphones, news crews setting up satellite trucks. Shame. The chanting began, growing louder with each passing moment. Violet stood up abruptly, her face set with grim determination. I have to go out there. I have to tell them the truth, explain about Crystal, about why I... Absolutely not, Jackson said firmly. That crowd isn't interested in explanations. They want blood. But if I don't, this will destroy your career. Violet's voice rose with panic. They'll say you're soft on racism, that you're compromising with the enemy. Your political future. I don't care about my political future. Jackson exploded, his composure finally cracking. Do you think I care about polls and elections when there's a lynch mob forming outside your door? The word lynch mob hung in the air like a physical presence, and Violet flinched as if she'd been slapped. That's what this is, isn't it? She whispered, looking out at the growing crowd. Exactly what Crystal fought against her whole life. People judging without knowing, condemning without understanding. Michelle's phone buzzed with a text from her sister. Girl, what are you doing? Get out of there before this ruins Jackson's career and your life. Then another from her best friend. Michelle, honey, I love you, but helping that racist woman is going to backfire. Think about your future. And another from her own mother. Baby, I know you have a good heart, but some people don't deserve forgiveness. Come home. Michelle stared at the messages, her heart breaking as she realized that even the people who loved her didn't understand what they were trying to do here. "They're right," Violet said quietly, having seen Michelle's expression. "Your family, your friends, they're right. I'm toxic. Everything I touch turns to poison." She walked to the window and looked out at the crowd, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "Maybe I deserve this. Maybe this is justice for what I did to your wedding, your happiness. Don't you dare," Michelle said fiercely, standing up. "Don't you dare let them turn you back into the bitter woman who made that call. Crystal didn't die so you could give up on love." But Violet was already moving toward the front door. "No, Michelle. I won't let my mistakes destroy your marriage, Jackson's career, your future together. This ends now." "Violet, stop," Jackson called out, but she was already reaching for the doorknob. Outside, the crowd sensed movement and surged forward, cameras flashing, voices screaming, the mob mentality taking hold. "I'll tell them the truth," Violet said, her hand on the door. "I'll tell them you tried to help me, that this was all my fault, that you're good people who showed mercy to someone who didn't deserve it." "And then what?" Michelle demanded, tears streaming down her face. "They'll tear you apart, and for what? So we can all go back to our separate corners, having learned nothing." Violet turned back one last time, her pale blue eyes filled with a lifetime of regret. "Maybe some mistakes can't be forgiven, Michelle. Maybe some bridges can't be rebuilt." She opened the door, and the roar of the crowd crashed over them like a tsunami of hate and judgment. In that moment, watching Violet step out to face the mob alone, Jackson and Michelle realized they were about to lose not just their newfound friend, but everything they'd believed about the power of love to heal the world's deepest wounds. The crowd surged forward, and Violet Ashworth disappeared into the chaos. For exactly 3 seconds, Jackson and Michelle stood frozen in Violet's doorway, watching the mob swallow their fragile friend whole. Then Michelle did something that would be replayed on every news channel for weeks. She grabbed the megaphone Jackson kept in his car for campaign events, stepped onto Violet's front porch in her flour-dusted clothes, and shouted with the full power of her lungs, "My name is Michelle Rivers, and this woman saved my life." The crowd's roar faltered, confusion rippling through the mass of protesters as cameras swiveled toward the mayor's wife. "2 days ago," Michelle continued, her voice carrying across the suddenly quieter street, "Mrs. Violet Ashworth made a terrible mistake. She called the police on our wedding because of her own pain and prejudice." The crowd began to murmur angrily, but Michelle held up her hand. "But yesterday morning, this same woman taught me something about grace that I'll carry for the rest of my life." Jackson appeared beside his wife, and together they formed a protective barrier around Violet, who stood trembling between them. "You want to know what racism looks like?" Michelle called out. "It looks like a grieving mother who lost her daughter and let that grief turn into hate. But you want to know what love looks like? It looks like choosing to heal instead of hurt, even when hurt is easier." "She called the cops on you," someone shouted from the crowd. "She tried to destroy your wedding." "Yes," Jackson stepped forward, his mayor's voice commanding attention. "She did, and it was wrong. But standing here today, screaming for her blood, demanding she be destroyed, how is that any different from the hate that caused this in the first place?" A young black woman pushed to the front of the crowd, her sign reading, "No forgiveness for racists." "Mayor Rivers, with all due respect, you don't get to tell us how to respond to racism. Some of us don't have the luxury of forgiveness." Jackson nodded gravely. "You're absolutely right, Keisha." The use of her name, he remembered her from community meetings, surprised her. "I don't get to tell anyone how to feel. But I do get to tell you what I choose. And I choose to believe that people can change. Even racists? Another voice called out. Especially racists, Michelle answered before Jackson could speak. Because hate is a sickness, and you don't cure sickness by cutting out the patient's heart. That's when something unexpected happened. A small, clear voice cut through the crowd noise. Mrs. Ashworth? Is that you? Everyone turned to see a young black woman, maybe 25, pushing through the crowd with a toddler on her hip and tears streaming down her face. Destiny? Violet's voice was barely a whisper. The young woman reached the front of the crowd, her little boy clinging to her neck. Mrs. Ashworth, it's me. Destiny Williams. You probably don't remember, but I remember, Violet said softly. Crystal brought you home for dinner. You were aging out of foster care. Destiny nodded, tears flowing freely now. Miss Crystal helped me get my GED, helped me apply for nursing school. She saved my life. She looked around at the hostile crowd. What are y'all doing to her mama? The change in the crowd's energy was palpable. Confusion replaced anger as this young black mother defended the woman they'd come to condemn. But she called the police on. Someone started. I don't care what she did, Destiny said firmly, shifting her son to her other hip. Miss Crystal taught me that hurt people, but love people. Mrs. Ashworth, you helped raise the woman who saved my life. That makes you family. More voices began rising from the crowd, not in anger now, but in recognition. Wait, is this Crystal Thompson's mother? Crystal Thompson who worked at Family Services? Crystal Thompson who got my cousin clean and helped her get her kids back? Crystal Thompson who came to my grandmother's funeral even though she wasn't supposed to get personally involved? Violet looked around in amazement as story after story emerged from the crowd. People Crystal had helped, families she'd saved, children she'd protected, dozens of them, all here by coincidence, all suddenly seeing Violet not as a racist villain but as the mother of their guardian angel. Miss Crystal talked about her mama all the time, an older black man called out. Said her mama taught her that love was a choice you made every day, even when it was hard. She said her mama made the best Christmas cookies in the world, a teenage girl added, and that she hoped to be half the woman her mama was someday. Violet was sobbing now, overwhelmed by these glimpses of how Crystal had described her to the very people Violet had learned to fear. Michelle stepped forward, her voice gentle but clear. Mrs. Ashworth made a mistake born from grief and loneliness. But yesterday she chose love over hate. She chose to learn, to grow, to honor her daughter's memory by becoming the woman Crystal always believed she could be. Jackson raised his voice. Now we all have a choice. We can tear down or we can build up. We can destroy or we can heal. What would Crystal Thompson want us to choose? The crowd was quiet now, the anger replaced by something more complex, understanding, sympathy, even hope. Destiny stepped forward and, in front of everyone, wrapped Violet in a gentle hug. Miss Crystal is watching, she whispered, and she's proud of you for trying to make this right. One by one, others began to step forward. Not to condemn, but to share their own stories of Crystal's impact. And slowly, miraculously, what had begun as a mob bent on destruction became something else entirely, at a community choosing healing over hate, a neighborhood choosing love over fear, at a chance for redemption that none of them had seen coming. But as the crowd began to disperse and the news crews packed up their equipment, none of them knew that the real miracle was still to come. 1 year later, Maple Grove Lane looked nothing like the sterile, segregated street it had once been. the sound of children's laughter echoed from Violet's backyard, where she was teaching a group of neighborhood kids, black, white, Hispanic, and Asian, how to make Crystal's famous Christmas cookies. At 68, her silver hair was softer now, often dusted with flour, and her pale blue eyes sparkled with the kind of joy she'd forgotten was possible. "No, no, Jamal," she laughed, gently guiding the 8-year-old's hands. "We fold the chocolate chips in, we don't stir them to death." "But Miss Violet," little Destiny Jr. piped up from his perch on a kitchen stool, "my mama says you gotta be tough with cookie dough." "Your mama," Violet grinned, "is an excellent nurse but a terrible baker. Don't tell her I said that." The transformation had begun 6 months ago when Michelle had suggested something radical. What if Violet turned her grief into purpose? What if, instead of hiding from Crystal's legacy, she embraced it? The result was the Crystal Thompson Community Kitchen, a program that operated out of Violet's renovated garage 3 days a week, teaching cooking skills to families in need while providing free meals to anyone who was hungry. It had started with just Violet, Michelle, and 5 families. Now it served over 200 people a week. Miss Violet. Keisha, the young woman who'd challenged Jackson at the protest, burst through the back door carrying grocery bags. "The Patterson family sent these vegetables from their garden, and Mrs. Chun wants to know if you need help with tomorrow's prep." Keisha had become one of Violet's fiercest advocates after discovering that her own grandmother had been helped by Crystal years ago. Now she coordinated volunteers and managed the program's social media presence. And, Keisha continued with a grin, Channel 7 wants to do another feature story. Something about From Hate to Hope, 1 year later. Violet wrinkled her nose. "Do I have to? You know how I feel about cameras." "Mrs. Ashworth," Jackson's voice came from the kitchen doorway, where he stood with Michelle, both of them beaming, "You're going to have to get used to the spotlight. The governor wants to present you with the State Community Service Award next month." "The what?" Violet nearly dropped her mixing bowl. Michelle stepped forward, her eyes bright with pride. "For the Community Kitchen Program. It's being replicated in 12 other cities. You're about to become famous, whether you like it or not." Violet looked around at the bustling kitchen, at the children covered in flour, at the teenagers helping package meals for delivery, at the parents learning skills that would help them feed their families better. This beautiful chaos that had grown from the ashes of her darkest moment. "Crystal would have loved this," she whispered. "She does love it," Destiny said, appearing in the doorway with her nursing school textbooks. "I can feel her smiling every time I walk in here." The young woman was graduating next month, following in Crystal's footsteps with a degree in social work. Violet had not only attended every one of her graduation events but had helped pay for her books and uniforms. "Speaking of Crystal," Jackson said, his voice taking on that careful tone he used for important announcements, "Michelle and I have something to tell you." The kitchen fell quiet as everyone sensed something significant coming. That Michelle's hand moved to her still flat belly, and Violet's eyes widened as understanding dawned. You're pregnant." Violet breathed. Michelle nodded, tears sparkling in her eyes. 14 weeks. "And Jackson and I, we've been talking about names." "If it's a boy," Jackson said softly, "we want to name him Harold Crystal Rivers, after your husband and your daughter." "And if it's a girl," Michelle added, "we want to name her Crystal Violet Rivers." The silence that followed was profound. Then Violet began to cry, not the bitter tears of grief she'd shed for so many years, but tears of overwhelming gratitude and joy. "You want to name your baby after Crystal?" she whispered. "And after you," Michelle said firmly. You taught us that love doesn't end with death. It transforms. Crystal's love transformed you, and your love is transforming this entire community. But I'm the one who ruined your wedding, Violet protested weakly. Jackson shook his head. You gave us something better than a perfect wedding day. You gave us a perfect life. This kitchen, this community, this family we've built, none of it would exist if that day had gone according to plan. The children had gone quiet, sensing the emotional weight of the moment. Even little Destiny Jr. seemed to understand that something important was happening. Miss Violet, Keisha said softly, remember what you told me when I first started volunteering here? You said Crystal taught you that every ending is really a beginning, and every broken heart is just making room for more love. Violet nodded, unable to speak. Well, Keisha continued, looks like your heart made room for all of us. As if on cue, the timer went off for the cookies in the oven. Everyone laughed, breaking the emotional tension, and rushed to pull out perfect golden brown circles that smelled like love and hope and second chances. Later that evening, as the last volunteer headed home and the kitchen was cleaned and quiet, Violet sat on her front porch with Jackson and Michelle, watching the sunset paint Maple Grove Lane in shades of gold and possibility. Do you ever wonder, Violet asked quietly, what Crystal would think of all this? Michelle placed a gentle hand on her rounded belly. I think she'd say her mama finally learned the most important lesson of all. Which is? Jackson smiled, reaching over to take both women's hands in his. That love doesn't have an expiration date. It just keeps growing even when we think it's gone forever. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, 3 people who should have been enemies sat together in perfect peace, bound by a love that had conquered hate, a grace that had defeated judgment, and a faith that had turned the worst day of their lives into the beginning of their most beautiful chapter. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour, and Violet could swear she heard the echo of her daughter's laughter carried on the evening breeze, reminding her that sometimes the most broken things become the most beautiful when love gets hold of them. And in 9 months, when little Crystal Violet Rivers took her first breath, she would be born into a world made better by the collision of 3 hearts brave enough to choose love over everything else. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next. Click on the image or video showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.